Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to our 2025 Coase Lecture. The University of Chicago Law School, throughout our history, has certainly always been committed to interdisciplinary scholarship. That was part of the founding vision of our law school. And our faculty have, over our history, drawn on methods and knowledge from other disciplines in order to expand our understanding of law and legal institutions. And in so doing, our faculty have, from time to time, created entire new paradigms for understanding law and legal institutions. And one of the most powerful examples of this is, of course, economic analysis of law, or law and economics. And law and economics has influenced our understanding of nearly every field of law. Within certain fields of law, it is the primary method for now understanding that field. This all occurred in a little more than a generation that it became standard in legal education in the United States, and the University of Chicago, with our dedication to this field and as the birthplace of law and economics, has been a pioneer in this. And so we're immensely proud of this history and its continuation today. Part of this was, of course, Ronald Coase, who was the Clifton R. Musser Professor of Economics at the law school. And he very powerfully deployed the tools of economics to help us understand law and legal institutions. And now I'm sure all of you, all the students who are here today, are familiar with the Coase theorem. I'm not going to cold call anyone. As you know, that came from his very famous article, The Problem of Social Cost. And that was not his only contribution. Coase made very important contributions in many other areas, including the allocation of the spectrum of the Federal Communications Commission, contributions about durable goods monopolies, the private provision of public goods, and the theory of the firm. And indeed, he was the founder of what we now call transactions cost economics. And for these contributions, he received in 1991 the Nobel Prize in Economics, becoming the first, and I think still only, professor in a law school to receive a Nobel Prize in Economics. And the following year, the Coase Lecture was established in the law school to celebrate his contributions and legacy and the law school's great history of law and economics. And so it's wonderful to continue that tradition today. Each year, we, as part of the Coase Lecture, select a faculty member to talk about their scholarship, to talk about an idea from law and economics, and to introduce that idea to our students and to our faculty. And so I'm thrilled that today our 2025 Coase Lecturer is Professor Jacob Goldin, the Richard M. Lipton Professor of Tax Law here at the law school. Professor Goldin is a scholar of astonishing range, radiant brilliance, and extraordinary accomplishment. He uses the full range of interdisciplinary tools in economics. You feel the range of his tools. The full range of tools in law and economics, as well as a mastery of tax law, to illuminate many areas of law. He is extraordinarily productive as a scholar. In the past decade, he's published more than 30 academic articles. They have appeared in the highest caliber law reviews and in peer-reviewed journals. For example, he and his co-authors have produced outstanding scholarship that asks fundamental questions about our legal system. In some work, he has examined, for example, why pretrial detention has an influence on rates of pleading guilty or on recidivism. He has analyzed whether health insurance mandates actually improve health outcomes, a highly relevant policy question in recent years on which there was not convincing quantitative evidence, and he and his co-authors provided it. And in studies such as these, Professor Goldin has accessed enormous administrative records with millions of observations. He has analyzed actual experiments and quasi-experiments that allow for the identification of the causal effect of law according to the highest standards of social science. And in much of his work, he has investigated the impact of tax law on low-income households. He's produced a superb body of work that examines how low-income households access legal benefits, how information about the law shapes that access. He's done this on areas such as the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit. And relatedly, he's also explored how enforcement decisions shape program participation. For example, last year, he published an outstanding study that looked at racial disparities in the rates at which the IRS conducts tax audits. In again, accessing hundreds of millions of observations and records, he and his co-authors documented the existence of this disparity, challenged the conventional understanding of its causes, and produced a method for improving tax audits that would eliminate this disparity. Professor Goldin graduated from Wesleyan University with an undergraduate degree in economics and government. He went on to earn a PhD in economics from Princeton, a law degree from Yale. He clerked for our own Judge Richard Posner of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. He has twice served in high-level roles at the Office of Tax Policy in the U.S. Treasury Department. Before joining our faculty, he was a faculty member at Stanford. He's also a research affiliate at the NBER and the American Bar Foundation. His topic today is, when should legal rules be used to redistribute income? I am thrilled he is our 2025 Coase Lecturer. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jacob Goldin.
Great. Well, thanks so much for that generous introduction. At the risk of undermining some of what Tom was just saying, just as do you remember that feedback, right, that you heard, right, when Tom was talking? Right as he was talking about my radiating brilliance, I decided that would be a good time to turn on my mic, which, caused all that. So anyways, thanks. It's obviously a great honor to give this year's lecture. I watched some of the old Coase lectures online, and I learned a ton, probably more than I should admit. I sort of feel like as a professor, you should know this stuff, but we have brilliant colleagues here, and I learned a ton. So for the law students here, looking at those is a great way to learn about some of the big ideas in law and economics. Okay, before I get started, I want to just acknowledge that most of the stuff I'm going to talk about today was figured out by other people. So Louis Kaplow, Steve Chevelle, as well as others, some of whom are here today, like David Weisbach, Lee Fennell, Richard McAdams, and then Kristen Chirical, Christine Joles, Zach Lisko. I'm going to be drawing on all their work. David, in particular, has written a lot about this topic and actually did a Coase lecture on this back in, I think, 2002, which used to be online until I asked IT to delete it from the website so that people would watch me instead. Okay, so lots of law and economics is about this question of how to design legal rules that are efficient. And lots of the criticism of law and economics is that it is about this question of how to design legal rules that are efficient. And that by sort of focusing just on efficiency, we miss the effect of how legal rules affect the distribution of resources around, throughout society. So I want to make 3 points. The first is that all else equal, law and economics favors redistribution. By that I mean that the normative framework underlying law and economics gives us a principled set of reasons to prefer policies that shift resources from the rich to the poor, all else equal. Okay, that's point 1. Point 2 is that accounting for an income tax dramatically narrows the range of situations in which it makes sense to redistribute through legal rules. This means that if the justification for adopting some inefficient legal rule is that it has some good effect on the distribution of resources in society, it will often actually be a better policy to just adopt the efficient rule while also making some change to the income tax. That's point 2. Points 1 and 2 pretty well established in the literature, I think. Point 3, I'll try to say something new at the end. Even with an income tax, there are still some situations in which the standard law and economics model tells us to deviate from the efficient legal rule. So I'll try to describe some of the intuition for recognizing when those cases arise. Okay, so starting with point 1. The normative foundation for modern law and economics is this thing we call welfarism. Welfarism says that a society should care about, the thing a society should care about is the well-being of the people in the society. Okay, what does well-being mean? Well-being here is basically a utilitarian conception of value in which a person's well-being is the degree to which their preferences are satisfied. Keep on going down, right? What our preference is. And the idea is that people have just like stuff they care about. They have goals and objectives, and these are measured by their preferences. Sometimes we say utility. And what do they depend on? Well, they could depend on like anything, right? Like anything that people care about. So this can include wealth and material resources, but it could also include subjective mental state. That's like a fancy word for their happiness, right? It could other things that people care about that are not happiness, like meaning or like, ideology or other moral stuff. Okay, so bottom line, if you have a society that's guided by welfarism, it should select among policies according to how each policy option advances or does not advance the stuff that the people living in that society actually care about. Okay, that's what welfarism is. So let's think now about what welfarism, which is the foundation of law and economics, what does that mean for redistribution? So suppose we're choosing between two policies. Policy one leads to more wealth or resources in the hands of the poor. Policy two leads to more total wealth in society. The question is, can welfarism ever support us choosing policy one in order to end up with a better distribution of resources, even though policy two would lead to more total resources in society? The basic answer is yes, and there are at least two reasons why it could be true. The first is probably the more familiar, which is that the thing we care about is not wealth, it's well-being, right? And we think generally that an extra dollar of wealth translates into more well-being for a poor person than for a rich person. This is probably familiar to most people here. Just declining marginal utility of income is how we talk about this. So from a welfarist perspective, it's better to get dollars into the hands of the low-income people in society as compared to getting dollars into the hands of the rich people in society, because it'll help low-income people satisfy their preferences more, and high-income people will be able to sort of satisfy their preferences without the extra money. Okay, so that's point one. A second reason we might prefer the policy that has better distributional effects. It's like a lot of feedback. Let me try to move this down a bit. Is that better? Okay, so maybe it's better. Okay, so that was point one, declining marginal utility of income. A second reason that we might decide and choose to adopt a policy that has sort of a better distributional effect is not that we care about, is because we don't just care about the total amount of well-being in society, but we also care about the distribution of well-being across members in society. So, for example, we might care more about increasing the well-being of the poorest member of society as opposed to the richest member of society. And this idea is a variant of welfarism, often called prioritarianism, sort of associated with philosophers like Derek Parfit. If that's your normative starting point, that's another reason, separate from declining marginal utility of income, to prefer the policy that leads to a more equitable distribution of resources. Okay, all else equal, what does all this mean? The normative principles that underlie law and economics gives us plenty of reasons to care about the distribution of resources. And in particular, it's generally a good idea to try to adopt policies that move resources from the hands of rich people to the hands of poor people, all else equal. Okay, so what does this mean for thinking about whether or not we want efficient legal rules? We have to define efficiency. So when people talk about efficiency in this context, they usually mean Kaldor-Hicks efficiency. That's the idea that if we're thinking about a new policy, we ask people, how much would you pay to adopt this new policy? Right? If you really want the policy, you would pay a lot. If you don't really care, you might not pay much at all. If you really don't want the policy, you would give a negative answer, right? And someone would have to pay you in order to make you as well off from taking this policy. And so to figure out if a reform is efficient in this Kaldor-Hicks sense, what we do is we just add up all these answers from everyone, all these answers to how much would you pay to get this new policy. And if the final answer is positive, then we say that this is an efficiency improvement. If the final answer is negative, then we say it's inefficient. And so when we're talking about an efficient legal rule, we're just talking about choosing a legal rule where there's no way to change things in a way that would give us an efficient reform. Basically, it's efficient if the gains to the winners are more than the losses to the losers, where we sort of put everything in dollar terms. Okay, so what would it look like if we were to set policy just focusing on efficiency? So I think the starkest example, and this is going to be an example where things kind of go wrong, is say there's a city with two neighborhoods. One is rich, all the rich people live in one neighborhood, all the poor people live in the other neighborhood. The housing in the rich neighborhood is too expensive for the poor people to afford. And the city has sort of enough in its budget to turn an empty lot into a brand new beautiful park. and it has to decide which neighborhood, the rich one or the poor one, where it wants to put that park. So should it go in the rich neighborhood or in the poor neighborhood? And so let's ask, which choice would be more efficient? To answer this, right, what do? We compare the willingness to pay of the rich neighborhood, everyone wants the park. It's just a question of sort of who's willing to pay more, right? That's the efficiency answer. So we compare the willingness to pay of the people in the rich neighborhood with the willingness to pay of the people in the poor neighborhood. And which number do we think is going to be bigger? Probably the rich neighborhood, right? And why? Because of this thing we've already talked about, declining marginal utility of income, right? So that the dollars mean less to the people in the rich neighborhood, and so they'd be willing to give up more to get the park, even if the people in the rich neighborhood and the poor neighborhood sort of care about the park equally. So what would the efficient choice be? It would be to put the park in the rich neighborhood. Okay, next question. Let's say we're going to like put like everyone wanted the park. What if we're going to put like a garbage dump? Nobody wants the garbage dump. We sort of repeat the exercise. Where does the garbage dump go based on willingness to pay? Right, in the poor neighborhood. And so you can see sort of repeating the story over and over. We're going to tend to put all the good amenities in the rich neighborhood and all the bad amenities in the poor neighborhood, at least if we're just sort of following efficiency. And this is the sense in which people often say that like efficiency on its own tends to be biased in favor of the interests of richer people, right? They're able to sort of afford a higher willingness to pay for this stuff. Okay, so you could, so does it follow from this that this is efficient, that we want to do it? No, not from a sense of what we actually care about, right? If we care about maximizing welfare, and the poor people also have preferences, about this, we're going to want to not just sort of follow efficiency, right? And in fact, if we're like prioritarian, we might put extra weight on the preferences of the people in the poor neighborhood, since their well-being is lower. So without knowing any more, can we say that like law and economics supports the efficient rule? No, right? And in fact, there's going to be lots of situations where we're going to think that law and economics is going to favor the inefficient rule, because that inefficient rule is going to do a better job at getting at well-being than the efficient rule would, because the efficient rule is just overweighting rich people by too much. Okay, so that's like the basic point. Without any further assumptions, we would expect that law and economics will give us good principled reasons to reject the efficient legal rule in favor for a legal rule that cares more about sort of equal distribution of resources. Okay, that was point one. Point two is how an income tax, the availability of an income tax, can change that conclusion. So the classic argument for why an income tax, the availability of an income tax changes that, comes from Kaplow and Chevelle, this article by Lewis Kaplow and Steve Chevelle. And the idea is, so I'll just like stick with their example. Suppose we're designing a legal rule for some tort to recover the damages caused by an accident, like a car crash. And suppose the accident causes like $10,000 of damages. And let's just take as given that the efficient rule is something like strict liability, where the tortfeasor, the one who caused the accident, owes $10,000 to the victim. Okay, here's the question. Should the amount of these damages be increased when the tortfeasor is rich and reduced when the tortfeasor is poor? Right, that's the sort of like type of redistributive legal rule we might want to consider. Right, do we impose extra damages when the person who caused the accident is a rich driver? Okay, what's the benefit of imposing larger damages on the rich driver? The obvious one is that it's a way to redistribute income, right? Our assumptions tell us that redistribution from rich to poor is good, all else equal. Okay, that's the benefit of making damages contingent on income, of charging the rich drivers more. What are the costs of that policy? Okay, anyone who's taken torts here should be able to spot one sort of immediate downside of this policy, one sort of efficiency cost, which is that if you're lowering damages for accidents caused by lower income drivers to be less than the harm the accidents produce, what are you doing to incentives? You're giving lower income drivers too little of an incentive to be careful, right? So they're going to be less careful than what would be efficient. And conversely, right, if you put sort of extra damages on rich drivers when they cause an accident, what are you doing to their incentives? you're giving them sort of like too much incentive to be careful. They're going to be they're going to exercise excess caution while driving relative to what would actually be efficient. You're basically encouraging those drivers to spend too much effort being careful. So that's one efficiency cost from this rich driver damages rule. Okay, but there's another sort of more subtle efficiency cost as well. And this is kind of the key point. Let's say this rule is in place, and maybe imagine there are a bunch of other rules like it that also get adopted, where rich people sort of have to incur extra damages when they're liable for something. Okay, now think about this as from the perspective of somebody who's trying to decide whether to like put in some extra overtime hours or like take an extra job to earn some extra income. All else equal, right? This is going to add an extra disincentive to earning extra income, right? Because now when all these rules are in place, if all these extra bad rules kick in as you earn more income, what does that do to the quality of life? If you're rich, it makes you worse off, right? So if you're trying to decide whether to earn more income, this is going to be an extra disincentive to doing that. So what would we expect? We'd expect when you adopt damage rules that impose sort of extra damages on the rich people, this is going to make people earn marginally less income as a result. So there are actually two distortions from this policy, right? There's two efficiency costs. First is it distorts how much people choose to earn, and second, it distorts how careful drivers choose to be when they're driving. Each of those is going to represent an efficiency cost from the policy. Okay, so two efficiency costs. Seems pretty bad, right? We don't actually know, though, if it's a good idea or not, because there's also this benefit, which was more redistribution. And so to decide whether this policy is good or bad, we would generally think we would compare the benefits of redistribution against the harm, which are these extra efficiency costs. Okay, so how do we do that analysis? The key argument, this is the key sort of point that Kapleau and Chevelle make, and sort of the key intuition that underlies the law and economics skepticism of legal rules. The idea is not that the redistributive legal rule is necessarily a bad idea in and of itself, but rather it's a worse policy than just making some change to the income tax. Okay, so here's the alternative policy to consider. However much redistribution the rich driver rule is able to accomplish, right? We know it's going to make rich drivers a little worse off and poor drivers a little better off. However much redistribution it's able to accomplish, let's instead adjust the income tax rates to provide exactly that same amount of redistribution. So however much redistribution the damages rule would accomplish, right? This income tax change is going to get us exactly the same amount, right? Maybe we raise the top tax rate a little bit, maybe we lower the bottom tax rate a little bit, maybe we increase something like the earned income tax credit a little bit. The claim by Kapleau and Chevelle, and in like sort of law and economics, is that this joint reform, that this income tax reform is going to be better than imposing higher damages on rich drivers. So let's like talk through why. On the pros side, on the pluses, right, both of those policies, the income tax reform and the driver rule, they both get us the exact same redistribution benefit, right? They're equally good in that sense. So that's a wash. They both redistribute the same amount. Redistribution was why we were drawn to this kind of policy, so they're equally good. Okay, what about the efficiency costs? The first efficiency cost was that the torts rule, the damages rule, distorted how careful someone would be. Oh, sorry, let's talk about the other one first. So the first efficiency cost was that the torts rule distorted how much income someone would choose to earn, right? How come? Because remember, we were sort of increasing the cost of earning more income. Richer people were going to face these extra damages. But the income tax generates exactly the same distortion, because that's what an income tax is, right? An income tax is the idea is that we impose some extra cost on you based on your income. And so, because we chose it to be exactly equal in terms of distribution, it's going to impose the exact same costs on people. And so it's going to affect their incentives to earn income in the same way. Let me say that all a different way. So imagine we're in a world where we have this higher income tax. The argument is that your incentive to earn income, how you think about whether to earn more income, is going to be exactly the same as if we're in this other world where we've adjusted all these legal rules to impose higher damages as you have more income. Both of those are going to make it more costly to you to earn more income. And so that efficiency cost is also a wash. So we've seen that the benefit is a wash, the redistribution benefit's a wash, that first efficiency cost is a wash, but here's the last efficiency cost is not a wash, and this is sort of what makes the income tax better, right? So the difference is that the income tax does not distort how careful drivers choose to be, right? Remember, the income tax reform involves just sticking with the efficient legal rule, which is where rich and poor drivers face the correct incentives for exercising care. They each owe $10,000, sort of regardless of the incomes of the tortfeasor. So with the income tax, right, we get all the redistributive benefit, we get one of the efficiency costs, but we avoid that other efficiency cost, which is that we don't distort how careful drivers are when they choose to drive. That's the whole argument. And that's the basis for the skepticism in law and economics of using legal rules to redistribute, right? It's not that legal rules can't promote redistribution, and it's not that redistribution is bad or a thing we don't want to do. It's that any redistribution you would want to pursue through the legal system, you could actually better pursue it by using the income tax. That's sort of the heart of the argument. Okay, now, even though I said this is the main basis of skepticism for using the legal system to redistribute, it's not the only one. And I'll just very quickly flag a couple of the other concerns here. We could talk more about them in Q&A if people have thoughts. In some cases, if you try to do redistribution through a legal rule, the parties might just contract around it. So you can imagine a court or a legislature adopts sort of stronger eviction defenses for tenants. What might you expect would happen? You might think that's good redistribution because tenants tend to be poorer than the landlords. What might you worry about? Well, you might just see those costs passed on in the form of higher rents, right? Because they're just basically being contracted around. And so, for situations like that, it could be that the legal rule is not an effective way to actually do the redistribution. Now, that's going to be more concerning for things like contracts than for things like torts, where you don't sort of have those opportunities to contract around. Okay, that's one concern. Another is sort of what often gets talked about as haphazardness. It's kind of weird to do redistribution through a legal rule, right? It seems kind of arbitrary, right? Because even putting aside sort of the different efficiency costs, why? If we think about that sort of damages rule where we put higher damages on the rich drivers, what about all the drivers who are rich who don't happen to get into accidents, or are all the lower income drivers who are driving who don't happen to get into accidents, right? None of them get any of that redistribution. So it feels sort of arbitrary where we're choosing to do all the redistribution to this kind of arbitrary thing, which is whether you happen to get into an accident or not. So that feels a little haphazard. And then the third sort of other type of criticism people often make is that there are different institutional competencies where legislatures making tax policy might be better at thinking about big picture distributional considerations, or you could have democratic theory type reasons why we want to centralize decisions about redistribution so that every court or every agency isn't just sort of making decisions according to its own distributional preferences. So all those could be extra factors cutting against using legal tools to redistribute. I also want to consider one extra factor that's going in the other direction, which can support more redistribution through law, which is that sometimes we think that income tax changes are actually off the table for political or other institutional reasons. Remember, right, the Kaplan-Chevelle argument just says that income tax reforms are a better way to do redistribution than legal rules. It does not say that we should prefer the efficient legal rule to the inefficient legal rule if we don't have the option of making an income tax reform. So in other words, if we imagine the income tax is stuck in place, we could say in an ideal world, sure, we would rather use the income tax to do a reform, but if we're not actually going to move it, let's just live in the world. Let's think about the world we actually live in and compare the efficient legal rule to the inefficient legal rule, which might have sort of better distributive properties. Now, a lot of the debate in this literature is that right to think about the income tax reforms as being off the table? if you sort of follow the news, there are actually or if you took tax, I guess, there are like pretty frequent reforms to the income tax. And you compare it to like the Sherman Act, right? Like, there's more reforms to the income tax than like lots of other areas of law. On the other hand, you could tell stories where maybe there's a mismatch where the legal rule is set by states, but we want to do our redistribution at the federal level. There's lots of reasons to sort of think that you would want to do that. Or maybe for like some sort of psychological reasons, people find certain forms of redistribution to be more palatable than others. So people might have more of a political objection to redistribution through the income tax, but less through legal rules. People argue that. You could sort of, I'd say the jury is out on a lot of these questions, but this is where a lot of the debate is, just in terms of this benchmark, whether we take from Kaplow and Chevelle and the fact that an income tax would be better ideally to the fact that we actually should, in practice, prefer to adopt efficient rules. Okay, so to review what we've covered so far, these are like my points 1 and 2 we've covered. The normative framework underlying modern law and economics says redistribution from the rich to the poor is generally good, but carries with it some efficiency cost. Sometimes that efficiency cost is going to be small enough to make more redistribution worth it, sometimes not. It just depends on how much you care about redistribution. But no matter how much you care about redistribution, we've seen that with legal rules like the tort reform, like the rich driver damages rule, undertaking the redistribution through legal rules that are inefficient is generally going to be worse than undertaking that same redistribution through the income tax. And the reason why is that the inefficient legal rule generates an extra efficiency cost, an extra harm in terms of what it distorts that you could avoid if you do the redistribution through the income tax instead. Okay, those are points sort of 1 and 2. That's sort of the conventional wisdom of the debate. I want to sort of take my last 10 minutes or so, probably be a bit less, turning to thinking about a little bit within this sort of like very standard setup, when does this argument for redistributing through the income tax break down? That is, like, when can there be, within sort of law and economics, within this sort of model, when can there be a case for using legal rules to distribute, even if those legal rules are inefficient, and even if there's an income tax that's also available? Okay, so to start, let's modify this hypothetical we're talking about with the damages to, before we were talking about imposing larger damages on richer drivers. And let's change it. So we're no longer gonna tie the damages directly based on the income of the tortfeasor. Instead, we're gonna be thinking about imposing higher damages on torts caused by activities that higher income people tend to do. So for example, let's think about saying like a rule that says that you owe more damages, not if your income is higher, but if you're driving an expensive car or a fancy car. And you owe less in damages if you got into an accident if the car you were driving was really cheap. Okay, so before, everyone get the distinction right? Before we were imposing damages based on the income of the drivers, on the driver being rich. Now we're imposing higher damages on the drivers of cars if their car was expensive, but we don't directly take their income into account. Okay, so the first question, would a rule like this help with redistribution? The old rule we were looking at, of course it did. That was sort of directly redistributive, right? Because it imposed higher damages on rich people. But probably this rule would also be redistributive, right? Because as long as the drivers of the expensive cars tend to be higher income than the drivers of the cheap cars, right? Because in that case, on average, the rule would impose higher damages when the tortfeasors that are richer than the victim, just because they'll tend to have fancier cars. So that's true, even though there's going to be some individual cases where the rule would sweep in low-income drivers who happen to have fancy cars. Okay, so a rule like this is indirectly going to redistribute from the rich to the poor, even though it's not directly about income, right? Just because it's basically giving harsher treatment to something that's correlated with people's income. It's kind of like the other rule was disparate treatment, and this rule is more like disparate impact. Same idea here. Okay, let's think about whether this indirectly redistributive rule, like the fancy car damages rule, can be better than the direct redistribution rule we were talking about before. Okay, the first thing to notice is that the fancy car rule is still going to generate some efficiency costs. Does everyone see that? Right? Like, what sort of efficiency cost is a damages rule tied to how nice your car is going to generate? Well, one thing you might expect is people are going to buy less fancy cars, right? Because if you happen to get into an accident, you're going to face less damages if you have sort of a cheap car than if you have a fancy car. So that's one distortion, right? That's one efficiency cost. What about the other distortion, the distortion to earning income? Okay, one possibility is that the fancy car rule distorts your income. It can distort your decisions about how much to earn income just in the same way that the rich driver rule did. That's one possibility. Do you see why? If we make it more expensive to buy things that you would like to buy, that you would like to spend your money on as you get richer, we're making it less attractive for you to get richer, right? And that's going to reduce your incentive to earn income. So put it a different way, right? It's just like it's basically the same distortion that the income tax is going to generate. So, basically it's like we're not directly taxing your new income. That's what an income tax does. But instead of directly taxing your new income, what are we doing? We're making it more costly to spend your new income on the stuff that you would like to spend it on. And that's in effect the same as taxing it, right? Your new income doesn't go as far. One reason it might not go as far is because you directly take a tax from it. That's what the income tax does. But the other reason it might not go as far is if you sort of add an extra cost to being higher income. And that's what a rule like this would do. Okay, so if you were planning to spend your new income on buying a fancy car, you're worse off, right? And so you might be less inclined to earn that new income. Okay, so that's one possibility. In that world, the fancy car rule would be just like the rich driver rule. And so we wouldn't want to do it if we had a different option instead, which is just to reform the income tax, right? You see it has the same sort of two distortions. Okay, here's another possibility though. It could be that people's tastes in expensive cars is not just about their income, right? So if a rich person started earning less, it could be that they'd still want to prioritize buying an expensive car. And if the differences in car choices between the rich and poor are not only caused by differences in their incomes, then if we up the damages on people who are driving expensive cars, that's not going to generate the same earning distortion that the income tax would. Right? Think of it from the perspective of someone who's deciding how much income to earn. And think of it, so the low-income person doesn't care about expensive cars. If they earn more income, if we put this damages rule in place that says, okay, if you're driving a fancy car, you're going to owe more in damages, I don't really care, right? Because I know I'm not going to spend my new money, the new income I earn, on that fancy car, and so I'm basically unaffected by that legal rule. So it's not, that new legal rule isn't going to affect, it's not going to generate any distortion to how much income I earn. Okay, so the more general point is that there can be differences between rich and poor in how much they engage in lots of activities like driving nice cars that are not just caused by the differences in their income. If those differences are not caused by differences in their income, then redistributing through a legal rule that regulates those activities might not generate all the same distortions as an income tax, and so it could be a good way to promote redistribution. Okay, the car example is I told this to someone and they were like, don't talk about this car, this is like a silly example. But here's a more sort of practical example that doesn't involve cars, but that's the same sort of insight. Okay, so go back to the city with the rich neighborhood and the poor neighborhood, where we're deciding where to put the park, right? Do we want to put the park in the rich neighborhood or do we want to put the park in the poor neighborhood? And remember we said, so if people's decisions about where to live are just about their incomes, then the standard Kaplan-Chauvel argument would apply, right? The argument would be that if we were to prioritize putting the good amenities in the rich neighborhoods, or let's say we were to switch from the efficient rule and we were going to put the good amenities in the poor neighborhoods, that would reduce the incentive to earn income, right? Because now you would have less of an incentive to earn income to move to the nice neighborhood. So instead, what would Kaplan-Chauvel say? Let's just put the park in the rich neighborhood and increase the income tax to make up for it, right? Stick with the efficient rule, which is put the nice stuff in the rich neighborhood, the bad stuff in the poor neighborhood, but offset it all with a change in the income tax. That's sort of the standard law and economics answer. But on the other hand, this argument sort of falls apart if people were pretty sticky in terms of where they want to live, even as their income changes, right? It's the same logic as with the fancy car. So if I'm thinking about earning some more income, and right now I live in the poor neighborhood, and I know that even if I earn this extra income, I'm still going to want to stay in the poor neighborhood, then where the park goes, where the garbage dump goes, that won't affect my incentive to earn income or not, because I wasn't even planning on using that new income to move neighborhoods. So do you see that, right? So then basically this could be a way to redistribute that doesn't involve sort of all the distortions that we would normally avoid with the income tax. Does this matter in practice? Well, there's actually, unlike maybe with the car example, there is this growing body of empirical evidence documenting the fact that people have very sticky ties to their communities, and they would rather not leave even if you sort of give them financial incentives to do so. Right? People have friends, family, they know the place, and there's all this literature sort of documenting that even if there's a good reason to move, there's better jobs somewhere else, people don't want to move. So if we're thinking about things like place-based investments, we might not want to just stick with the efficient rule, right? And instead we might want to prioritize putting some of the nicer amenities in poorer neighborhoods. That could be a good way to redistribute. Okay, just in my last couple minutes, I'll briefly mention a couple other examples of reasons why you might want to deviate from the sort of normal law and economics type reasoning here. One is this idea of salience, where people might not pay attention to the legal rules. So remember, we've been sort of assuming that when people are deciding how much income to earn, they're taking into account how they're going to face different legal rules if they're rich as opposed to if they're poor. And I think one principled argument against that could just be come on, obviously not, right? Do we really think that people who are not lawyers, especially probably most lawyers, right, are really going to be thinking about, all the changing legal rules as their income changes? And so if we think people are not going to be paying attention to those sort of things, then the changing legal rules doesn't generate the same incentives to avoid earning new income. You can make a similar argument with tax evasion, right? We know that not everybody pays their correct amount of income tax liability. We also expect that as the income tax rate gets higher, you have more and more incentives to reduce how much taxes you report owing, whether legally or illegally. And if you think of an extreme case where people only decide, when the tax rate goes up, they don't stop working, they just choose to report less. In that case, right, the income tax reform has this new distortion, right, because it causes deadweight loss, it causes an efficiency cost, because people spend all this energy on tax avoidance or tax evasion. Whereas if you sort of have a redistributive legal rule, it doesn't have that same form of efficiency, right? You can't, even if you underreport your taxes, you can't, that doesn't really help you in the case where you've caused an accident and you have a fancy car. Right, so again, it could be another reason why it could be sort of more efficient to redistribute in a way that violates from what would otherwise be the efficient legal rule. Okay, let me stop there. So I'll just summarize. What hopefully I've convinced you with these examples is not that we always want to use legal rules to help with redistribution when there's an income tax, but rather that the form of arguments you should make, or one should sort of think of as potentially being persuasive in those contexts, right? The regulated act, for example, if the regulated activity is something where we expect rich and poor people to care about differently, even independent of their incomes, if we think if we think people aren't really paying attention to legal rules, or if we think there's sort of a lot of tax evasion, maybe especially if you're in a country other than the United States, where we think there's even more sort of evasion and less sort of infrastructure for detecting tax evasion. These are all situations where you might be more inclined to consider redistributive legal rules. Okay, thanks. Yeah, Saul.
I wonder if you want to take prices into account. So if you move nice parks, for example, from the good neighborhood to the poor neighborhood, then also people's demand for housing in the good neighborhood will go down. So we have to take that into account. I'm not sure what you think that'll do to redistribution. I mean, in the short run, it makes wealthy people get better off. They have money left for other goods. On the other hand, there's a tax rate on it, or maybe some poor people will move into what you call a better neighborhood. Like, it feels like you're not taking that into account.
Because I'm not taking it into account, yeah.
I don't think it's true for cars, because there we think the price of the fancy car is more about the marginal cost of producing it.
Well, I do think
housing.
I actually do think it's true for cars as well. So the question's about sort of like, how do we think about price effects? We might think more generally about a question of incidence, where sort of the benefits, the sort of, even if we're trying to redistribute, it sort of like ends up sort of helping someone else generally. And so I think the example I very briefly mentioned, sort of like landlord-tenant protections, that's sort of the easiest case where we might think things like price adjustments are going to undo a lot of the redistribution that affects. Now, it doesn't necessarily make things that much worse, because that also, by undoing the redistribution, you also undo some of the distortions to how much you earn. So the efficiency cost gets lower, but it doesn't really help you at all either. Now, I do think generally you have to worry about those sort of price adjustments. And in general, I think they're going to often dilute the redistributive benefit you get, but not all the way to zero. So basically, you end up just doing less redistribution. So basically getting less benefit, but also less costs than you would otherwise sort of expect. Yeah.
So I'm wondering in the car example, how the efficiency of changing the legal rule and the redistributive consequences would compare to a policy where you put a luxury sales tax in place on the purchase of an expensive car, right? It's interesting that your two examples focus on situations in which you're assuming the demand for a good, and then in one example, and then the demand for a particular piece of property are both sticky. And you could imagine that in those situations, you would use our two other major kinds of taxes, sales taxes and property taxes, to do the redistribution, and you could maybe accomplish this in that situation, the same amount of redistribution without affecting people's incentives to work, right? So if like the rich people still want to buy the fancy car, then why not tax them? Lower sales taxes on other things that poor people like to buy, or lower income taxes, so like some other, assuming that the same sovereign is collecting those taxes. And then you've moved money, you've already made the assumption that that won't change the incentive for rich people to buy the car because they're like dead set on their luxury cars, and you have not distorted the incentive to work, and you've also not distorted the incentives to drive safely. So why isn't that better?
It might be better. So the Kaplow-Chevelle, sort of the basic law and economics claim, says that inefficient legal rules, what you would like to do is adopt sort of what would be efficient if you didn't care about redistribution, and then combine that with a change to the income tax. I don't want to say that they acknowledge exceptions, and they would agree with, I think, with these exceptions, and they've discussed some of them in some of their work. But just the sort of like standard law and economics type of reasoning. If you one thing you might say is that even if we sort of thought that excise taxes, which could do sort of accomplish some of the same benefits, like you have an excise tax on like luxury cars, that could still require sort of a modification from the sort of normal law and economics reasoning, but a pretty simple one. So instead of saying that we should do all redistribution through the income tax and transfer system, we should do all redistribution through maybe like the tax system, which includes both income taxes, but also excise taxes. As like a tax person, I'm like fine with that. Let me just give one benefit, and then I think one case where it wouldn't help. So one case where it would help even more, you're sort of saying, pointing out it would accomplish the same benefits. It would actually do better because it avoids that haphazardness problem, right? So instead of just doing the redistribution for the owners of the fancy cars who happen to get into accidents, why not just do it, we could just sort of do it more generally on everyone who sort of buys the car. So that's sort of nice. You avoid sort of that haphazardness. We might be able to do it, depending on the legal instrument we think of. It doesn't necessarily have to be an excise tax. It could be like a fine or a fee. So some legal tools sort of avoid that haphazardness themselves. and would be sort of closer economically to how we think of an excise tax. So all reasons I think I'm like sort of supporting what you're saying. Here's the type of situation where I think an excise tax doesn't help, but a legal rule like this would, which is where the thing that the rich people are sort of doing differently is not just like liking the fancy car, but it's actually about the risk of getting into the accident. So for example, we might think that like for some types of accidents, the people who end up being rich tend to be more likely to get into those accidents. And for other types of accidents, other types of torts, we think that like getting into that tort, you might be less likely to get into it if you're rich. What that sort of reasoning would suggest is to up the damages on the torts where rich people are sort of more, the types of people who become rich are more likely to get into, and sort of lower the damages on the types of torts where the people who become rich are less likely to. And if you have a story like that in mind, you can't replicate it just through something like an excise tax. Yeah.
So I think it's a great review of all the arguments pro and con, but I worry that we're working with a really simple model and not a realistic model. So let me offer 3 kind of objections that are meant to introduce a realism. So the first is your discussion is really kind of taking place in a world where there's kind of we're going to hold political economy things. But the reality is, if we unconstrain the political economy, you can imagine that if I start punishing rich people and driving reasons or many locations, they'll turn around and start lobbying for benefits in other areas that will undo gains. So that's one. The second one is there's kind of an agenda limiting purpose that serves that ruling out redistribution, things like that, and setting damages and torts for autos serves, which is that, look, if judges can introduce, for example, redistribution, they can introduce other things like, well, I want to vote for a Republican, this is a defendant Republicans are bad people, or the person's not sufficiently nationalistic, so I want to introduce that too. So if I can do redistribution, I can do these other things that are part of the social welfare function that I. Or the third one, which is kind of a global optimization problem, which is, if the person doing the tort damages, the person doing the amenities, the person setting, prices of cars or something else, are each acting because they think on the margin I want to punish the rich guy. You can imagine a situation where you overdo the redistribution. One of the nice things about income tax, as suboptimal as it is that it's like a single place where we think about redistribution, and the fewer places we do that, the closer we get to like a global balance, as opposed to kind of hidden adjustments on the margin that might add up to be excessively optimal or insufficiently optimal.
Great. I'll sort of take my prerogative to answer just like a little bit of that. I'll say for the record, I don't think we should redistribute based on political party, since this is, I think just to sort of like situate the project is there's sort of like a lot of the literature in this area has sort of fallen into 2 different parts. One is sort of thinking about as sort of a matter of policy, if we're choosing sort of what policy to do, almost in an ideal sort of way or sort of unconstrained, which one would we suggest? And there the sort of law and economics answer is we'd rather sort of combine an income tax change with a move to an efficient legal policy. The other sort of part of the literature says, well, in practice, the way this advice actually gets implemented is to say, let's just do the efficient policy and without sort of worrying about the income tax change. More of sort of a prescriptive sort of idea about it. Like Lee and Richard have sort of written on that aspect of it. And I think your arguments sort of more speak to that second one. Like what happens when we sort of embed this in a political economy sort of framework, whereas my focus is really just trying to understand those like sort of first principles, which are really when is the case that if we have sort of our ideal tools, would we actually want to go in this direction? But lots of good stuff to think about, and we should talk more. Yeah, Vince.
So I understand the salience and the tax evasion ideas. I'm not sure I totally get the example about the car. And I guess maybe the way I put this quickly would just be to ask why I take the logic of the car example is that goods that the demand for which is wealth correlated are going to be, demand for those goods is highly inelastic. I think that's how it works, right? So irrespective of what, even if it becomes slightly more expensive to buy that expensive car, it's not going to really change the demand schedule of that.
Yeah, it's slightly different. So it's not about the price of the car. The question is whether we see sort of a correlation where we know rich people tend to buy expensive cars. The question is, are they buying those expensive cars just because they have extra money and they're rich, or would they prefer to buy if you were to sort of make them poor, would they still sort of all else equal prefer those cars more than the people who happen to be poor today? So it's about trying sort of understanding the source of that correlation in their preferences.
Okay, I guess what I'm not quite sure I get is why that example doesn't just if your rule doesn't introduce a distortion for the purchase decision for the rich people, why that example doesn't just collapse into your first example?
It does lead to a distortion in the purchase decisions of the rich people. It doesn't lead to a distortion in how much income they earn. Because basically they're not going to use, if you're a poor person, it's easier to see if you're sort of poor today, you're deciding whether to earn new income. The question is, do I want, if I'm going to use that new income on a car, right, that's on a fancier car, this new rule is making me way worse off. It's going to make me less likely to earn that income. But if I'm going to keep my Corolla, even as I earn more income, in that case, then it's not affecting my incentive to earn income in the same way. That's sort of the argument. Yeah, I think we have time for David.
Yeah, these arguments always seem abstract, and people never specify what legal rules they would want to use to redistribute. So I wonder if you could talk about that. And to me, tort seems like a bad one, a bad example to use, implausible. The two most important ones that maybe you can respond seem to be trade and immigration. And so if you wanted to use legal rules to redistribute, you want to have massive trade barriers and lots of deportations, I think. Do you think that's right, or what legal rules would you want to use?
Yeah, I think so. To reframe the question and sort of the benefit of what I'm doing, I think the thing that's useful about this way of looking at it is basically it sort of like makes precise the type of arguments you have to make to be sort of precise to say that like for trade or immigration. And so yeah, I don't know what stories we could come up with for those that sort of follow along these lines. I'm sure we could find some, but it's not, I think for a lot of trade and immigration stuff, you might actually want to do the efficient policy and then do the redistribution. The example of the ones I talked about that I think is more plausible than torts is the place-based redistribution, where I think we have a lot of empirical evidence that where people want to live is pretty sticky, and there are big differences in sort of outcomes based on where people live. So that I think could be a principled reason for doing place-based redistribution that you would sort of miss if you took the sort of standard law and economics approach.
And I think we have run out of time. Please join me.
Thanks so much.